Well, hello, folks. Welcome to the Disciple Dilemma. We're really excited to have Ashley Chesnut with us today, the author of It's Not Just You. Along with our co-host, Ray Monroe, we are going to, as two guys, listen to this lady help us understand the tsunami that's going up against women who are disciples in the church, servants of the Lord Jesus Christ. I think this is going to be a fascinating complementary view, as we heard from Greg and Stacy Oliver last week, talking about men and sexual brokenness and the family and discipleship. So Ashley's going to talk to us about women, sexual brokenness, and discipleship. Ashley is the associate minister for young adults at the church at Brook Hills in Birmingham, Alabama. She is leadership writ large in that crowd, working with young women, singles. She is an equiper of small group leaders. That's really fascinating for Ray and I as we talk about discipleship. She tends to be seen working a lot of people, whether it's young women, singles, or even families. Ashley's there, and she's working the bandwidth of people and issues that are out there. She's someone I term as a catalyst in Christianity, and she's out in Birmingham making things happen. This isn't her first book. You can check that out, but I really want you to think about It's Not Just You out at her website, www.itsnotjustYoubook.com. Did I get that right, Ashley?
That's right.
All right. So she is an advocate for abuse survivors on her Caring Well team. She's a coach of her women's leadership team. She's a Georgia gal. She's a PK, pastor's kid, daughter of a college minister. She made the decision to go to seminary, catch this, while she was in elementary school. Think about that. Ashley is a recipient earning an MDiv degree from Beeson Divinity School over at Sanford in Birmingham, Alabama. She has a certificate of biblical counseling from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. This is no lightweight, folks. We are up against a really sharp lady here. And then I was going to ask about the number of eggs a chicken lays. Is there anything there that we need to talk about?
All you need to know is that I grew up doing 4-H poultry judging, and I came from a county that was pretty good at it. So I do know about chickens, and I can tell you how many eggs a chicken's laid if I look at it.
Okay, folks, she'll probably post that on her website too. We'll look forward to hearing about that. So before we go into this thing, Ray Monroe with us again, and I'm just so thrilled that Ray's co-hosting this process, because Ray asks a lot of questions that I think we need to uncover in the realm of discipleship. He's a great friend to have along, makes me laugh. He's taught me a lot, and I'm really just honored, Ray, that you're a part of this walk with us on the Disciple Dilemma.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Delighted to be part of it. Really delighted to have met Ashley, and looking forward to the conversation.
I'd love to say this is going to be fun, but I think this is going to be challenging. So I've got two things I want to toss out to you, Ashley, and then I'm going to hand you the ball and you can run down the field. We're looking for the executive lowdown. Why did you decide to write this book? And you talk about sexual brokenness. What in the world is sexual brokenness? Help us out.
Thank you. And I'm excited to be here. So yes, so how did this book come to be? And the journey started over a decade ago. I was a seminary student, and I was leading a college small group just in my local church. And the junior year that I was of those girls being together, and I started with them freshman year, was with them until they graduated. And their junior year, that October, about half of the girls that I was discipling just started confessing like sexual sin that they were struggling with. And it was everything from sexual relations with their boyfriends to pornography to masturbation to, just the gamut, oral sex. And so even within that, it took us 2.5 years just to even get to that point in a relationship that they felt like they could share those things, much less begin to deal with them.
Wow.
And then the more that you walk with somebody, I realized that a couple of them had stories of trauma as well. And so some of them, the trajectory of sexual sin that they landed on is a trajectory that might never have happened had earlier sexual experiences, whether it was abuse or exposure to things. If that had never happened, their trajectory could have been completely different. And so that began a journey of just, seminary did not prepare me necessarily to deal with some of these things. And so I just started seeking out counselors. I started seeking out books and just resources, and finding a lot for men, but not finding a whole lot for women. Or the examples, they would give a nod to, hey, women would struggle with this too, but their examples would all be about men who struggle. And so just not really finding much that spoke to women. And I walked with those girls, and we were just doing the best we can with the word, and the word is sufficient, and the word is true. But there were things that I also was realizing that, the Bible doesn't necessarily have some of these girls' struggles in its concordance. And so how do we begin to think through things like masturbation, where not even the message is going to use that word? And so how do we know that that's a sin? Is it a sin? Why is it a sin? And so we've got to know principles of God's design to even answer the why question. And the more that our culture evolves with technology, I mean, we have sex robots now. You can get into sexual activity through AR and VR technology. And so just even the ways that we can engage sexually are increasing. And so wanting to basically write the book that I wish somebody could have given me 10 years ago, 12 years ago, as well as the book that I wanted to be able to hand girls to answer questions, to give them just a place to get started, but also to help them realize they are not the only woman who struggles with sexual sin. They're not the only Christian woman who struggles with sexual sin. And y'all, I'm in Birmingham, Alabama. So if it's happening in Birmingham, I have no doubt that it's happening across the country and around the world.
Wow. That's wild. And you looked for the resources early on and found that they were mainly directed at men and not really a good fit for women. So how are men and women really different in terms of their sexual brokenness? What's the difference that really occasions your book and makes counseling with, trying to help women, a different kind of task than trying to do the same thing with men?
Well, fundamentally, there are some differences, and then there aren't differences.
Sure.
So if we think about sin, and if we think about a sin struggle is really a worship struggle. So what is it that I'm worshiping, and what is it that I'm pursuing or seeking? And so on that level, men and women, you've just got to identify, what is it that you're seeking or wanting out of this? What is it you're loving the most, fearing the most, desiring the most? And so on that level, men and women would be the same. That's at the core. Sure. Sin is a worship issue. But there are other factors to consider with a person's story. And abuse is one of those that we need to consider as we work with young women. And not every woman has abuse in her story. But that is a dynamic we need to be sensitive to. And you're not going to see that mentioned in many of the books related to men. As we continue to progress and be more reflective about the teachings on sexuality in the 90s, I mean, the I Kiss Dating Goodbye culture, the True Love Waits church culture, as we begin to be more reflective on purity culture, we're realizing more and more about how that has affected men and women and in different ways. And so addressing some of those messages, and even I can point you to a great book called The Great Sex Rescue that did a survey of 20,000 Christian women on the effects of some of the top marriage books and how that has affected their marriages and their sexuality. And so things like that are addressing those issues and topics specifically with women. And You're not going to get that in books like Every Man's Battle.
Oh, wow.
Ashley, when you use the phrase purity culture, I'm imagining about half the folks listening are going, yay. And the other half are going like, what? So what I want you to do is unpack for us your view of purity culture as it affects women as disciples.
This is a very nuanced conversation. So I'm just going to give you very simplistic and just maybe one component of it. Okay. So for example, when I was growing up in student ministry and youth culture, it was very much a conversation that was, don't have sex until you're married. It's okay when you get married, but don't have sex. And so you hear this message of don't, but you weren't really told why. I mean, you knew STDs, STIs, like you got that in school, but there wasn't really a why. There wasn't really, what does sex even reflect about the God who created it? And the fact that he did create it, and what he created is good, but he's got parameters around the things that he's created so that we can enjoy them the way that he's intended. And then there became this guilt that has been added. And I've had so many friends that upon getting married, sex then became hard because it wasn't a light switch where all of a sudden their brain was like, yes, now it's okay. And they thought about sex as dirty. They felt dirty having sex, even though they were married. It affected their sexual performance and increased sexual dysfunction, which is what some of the research is showing. And so that's just one small example from purity culture and how it's affected women. And it affects men as well, but that's not quite so much what I'm focused on.
So I'm thinking what you're saying to me, if I could boil this down in a way, is purity culture is a code structure for a form of legalism in some ways that can be very dysfunctional for the broader, fuller life of Christ. Not that we're supposed to sin more that grace may abound as unmarried people, but that it does have its own form of gravity that pulls us in a legalistic way away from the cross and away from the grace and away from the fuller, more free life in Christ. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Absolutely. And it makes sense. Even culturally, we see pendulum swings, right? Where you have the sexual revolution of the 60s, 70s into the early 80s. Well, how are we going to respond? We're going to pendulum swing and we're going to emphasize purity. And I'm not saying that's bad, but when you become legalistic about it, you've got a pendulum swing and you're going all the way to the extreme instead of right here in the middle.
Of course, I come from that age and that group where you were supposed to somehow, as the male, be the lead, and therefore a lot of that was supposed to depend on you. And when your wife wasn't happy, it broke your heart. You felt like you were somehow inadequate and wrong in what you did. And I think you're absolutely correct that it becomes idolatry because we're trying to find our meaning and purpose in some place other than in God. But we're also not taught vocationally that everything I do for the glory of God. And this is supposed to be richly enjoyed and really supposed to be something that's a celebration where God is present. The Catholics treat marriage and sexual intimacy as a sacrament because they're confident that God is right there when we have that sexual experience. And when I look at marriage, my job as the male is supposed to be to sacrifice lovingly for my wife. And so how do we get to a discipling method that conversion is joining the army? It's not, and we give you a sword, the Bible, and then we point to the enemy, but we don't give you basic training. We don't tell you what it means to be a disciple. And so how do we get from where we are, and how does this fit into discipleship?
I will come back to your question.
Okay.
One thing before we move on from the purity culture conversation, and this does tie into discipleship, is there's also a sense of entitlement that was built into the purity culture where, I mean, even if you think about the purity ring, true love waits, it was very much a message that if you do X, you will get Y. So if I save myself, if I am pure, then I will not only get married, which is not promised in the Bible, not only will I get married, I will have great sex when I'm married. And so, what happens when I have been following Christ and I have been living a pure life, at least externally, and I hit 30 years old and I'm not married, and I'm thinking about, well, God, what's happened? Like, you haven't shown up. You haven't done what the church said you were going to do. And so where's my husband? And are you worth following? So I think there's also, this goes back to the discipleship problem, because the church, there has been some false teaching in the church related to sexuality. And sometimes the false teaching is the fact there's been no teaching and we've relegated discipleship to the world. But we've also, in some regards, created an entitlement culture, and it becomes about me and God, you failed me. You haven't followed through. Well, we didn't actually do a great job teaching people about what God and his word actually say on the subject. We just taught a version of it.
Stacy, is sexual brokenness your terminology? Is it terminology you borrowed from somewhere? What do you mean by sexual brokenness?
So it's not a term original to me. I don't know who came up with the term. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you it means that we're all sinners. We've all been affected by sin, whether it's sin we've committed or sin that we've encountered just living in a fallen world, or we've been sinned against. And sexual brokenness means that there is a fallenness, a sinfulness, a brokenness that relates to the area of sexuality. So maybe that is, I have sinned sexually, whether that is lustful thoughts, whether that is what I have sought out or pursued. But I've also been affected by sexual brokenness in the world, and the fact that, I mean, I can't drive down the interstate without seeing billboards. I can't get on Pinterest without there being arousing ads, so some of it, or TV. We haven't even talked about TV and commercials, much less the things that you intentionally seek out, just the things that you are just a participant in this culture. And so you are affected by the culture that you live in. And there's an influence and a shaping there that it's fallen and sinful to some degree because it's a sinful world. So sexual brokenness encapsulates all of that, at least for me when I use the term.
Huh. So aren't we all, at least at one level, sexually broken?
Yep, we are. And I think about what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 10:13, where he says, no temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity. And so the temptation itself is common. Now, how that temptation arrives and the form that it takes, but I mean, you and I might be tempted to do different things, but at the root of that temptation, if it's security we're both seeking, but just in different avenues, or if it's affirmation, or if it's satisfaction or significance, no temptation has overtaken you or me that is not common to humanity.
Wow. One of the things that at least in your book is pretty prominent is that one of the aspects of sexual brokenness is the trauma that many people experience in life, especially ladies in particular, having traumatic experiences when they're young. How does that affect this whole area of sexual brokenness?
One of the most shattering things that you can do to a person is to sexually abuse them, because it affects every area of their life. It affects them physically, it affects them emotionally, it affects their relationships, it affects their thinking, it affects their relationship with God. I mean, it literally devastates every area of their life. And so it's something that is pervasive in our culture and our world, and has always been. I mean, we have at least 3 rape scenes described in scripture. So we know that this isn't anything new. But the current statistics, depending on where you look, is that in America, 1/4 to 1/3 of all women have been abused, and 1/6 to 1/5 of all men. And so if you think about a church or your small group that you're sitting in, and you just even think the barest of that, 1/4 of all the women in your small group probably have abuse in their story. 1/6 of all men probably have abuse in their story. And if that was cancer, our churches, if 25% of our church had cancer, we would have a cancer ministry. If 25% or more of our churches have been abused and traumatized, wouldn't we have some sort of ministry or at least some sort of foundational knowledge of how trauma affects a person, just so we can love them well? We're not even talking about how that affects their relationship with God and how it affects their cognitive functioning or how it affects their choices. Shouldn't we have some sort of basic understanding of their suffering and what that is like? And oftentimes we look at a person and we judge them by the symptom. And so for many women that have experienced trauma, there's an acting out that happens. Sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's not. It might be alcohol. But we look at a person's life and see the symptoms and think she's got an alcohol problem, or she is a cutter and she's self-harming. But we deal with that rather than recognizing what's the suffering that this person is coping with the alcohol or with cutting or with sex. And I'm not going to do an effective job of helping somebody fight sin if I'm not acknowledging and dealing with the suffering that they've also experienced in their story.
Yeah, one of the challenges we face, of course, is that the scripture says we're supposed to confess, and confessing really would mean trying to grapple with the basic real trauma that caused me to act out in a broken way. But we don't really teach that very well. But then, of course, our leaders and even people who've been in the church a long time are unprepared if somebody did come and begin to try to explore why they're broken and needs help. Where would I go? How would the church organize itself so that it could really minister to people who've had a traumatic background?
There are many answers to that question. I mean, I'm even just thinking about how are seminaries training ministers? Are we including just even basic counseling classes as a requirement? Are we doing training for pastors on dealing with trauma? So I would say seminary wise, we need to start including this in our curriculum. And it needs to be part of the training for ministry. As people in the church, not everybody's going to be a counselor. Not every church can afford to hire a counselor. And so with that, I would say we need to educate ourselves. And so often we put the burden of education on the abuse survivor. Like, not only have you experienced this traumatic thing, but now I expect you to teach me how it affects you. And they're just trying to survive the day and don't have the energy to also be your teacher. And so we can also serve people well by teaching ourselves, and that can be reading widely. And Diane Langberg is a great person to start with. Her book, Suffering and the Heart of God, is absolutely phenomenal. And it's written not just to counselors, it's written to lay people, it's written to pastors. If you want to understand trauma, start there. But you can also listen, there's all sorts of survivor stories out there within the church and outside of the church. And you can get those from podcasts, you can get those from the Caring Well conference that happened within Southern Baptist World in 2019, and they have survivor stories. But start listening and learn how to be an active listener and learn to cultivate empathy for people. And so being a learner isn't just how much information I can absorb. Being a learner also means that I'm cultivating understanding and empathy for you as a person. And I'm imagining, how would I feel? What would it be like to have experienced this? And I probably wouldn't respond very differently because, again, we're human. So I would say listen to people's stories and listen with the posture of a learner, not a fixer.
So
I love that answer. I really love where you're going with this. And there's a dynamic that I wanted to interject into this, because Ashley, your book primarily is hope for women who've been traumatized and abused, primarily. Is that fair?
Actually, I would say no.
Okay, good. Good.
I love it, Ashley. Good response.
It's fine. My ego's fine. Don't worry about my ego. It's fine. It's fine.
It's okay.
I'm gonna get a Kleenex. I'll be back in a minute.
Yeah, sorry. No. So I have 2 chapters on trauma and abuse. But the bulk of it is just about sexual sin and sexuality in general.
Pilgrim through this barren land, I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful